Okay, good evening. I'm Cindy Barrett, and on behalf of the Alberta Society of Artists and the Stanley A. Milner Library, I'd like to welcome you to this evening's lecture with Robert Lemay. I'd just like to announce our last lecture this year will be by Lynn Malin, who is an ASA member, and that will take place on Thursday, October 18th, here in the Library Theatre. I'm currently working on next year's scheduling of lectures, and I hope to announce the details at October's lecture. Now on to our guest artist this evening, Robert Lemay. Robert lives in Edmonton and has exhibited at the Douglas Udell Gallery for at least the past 20 years. He also exhibits at several major galleries across Canada, and his work can be found in major collections across, well, internationally, shall we say. Robert Lemay is a still life artist, a subject he never tires of. His paintings try to reach a Zen-like state of mindfulness or simplicity in contemplating a few everyday objects. He enjoys translating the visual phenomenon of light, transparency, translucency, reflections, shadows, and color. This, I think you will agree with me, he does very successfully. Now, please welcome Robert Lemay.
Thanks, Cindy. Should adjust that. Hi. Sorry. Thanks. Thanks. I'd like to thank Chris Carson and Cindy Barrett for organizing this event and the Alberta Society of Artists for inviting me. It's a great honor, and thanks. Thanks to my sister Nicole Lemay for putting together the PowerPoint aspect of tonight's talk, and thanks to Shauna Lemay for getting my handwritten words onto the computer. And thank you all. Okay, I'd like to start with this image because it represents the fundamentals of Western art since the Renaissance. Thought to be by Leonardo da Vinci, this is a drapery study dating from around 1478. The study illustrates everything I think representational art is, namely a depiction of the fall of light on objects. For a practicing artist, I think this piece expresses everything you need to know about mastering form. What we see employed in this piece is the three-tone system, which I think of as the equivalent of the musical scale in Western music. The first tone is the gray paper. The second tone is the black crayon modeling the form and shading from gray to black. And the third tone is the white highlights, which represent the most illuminated part of the drapery. Variations of the three-tone system have been employed by artists ever since. Even the modeling in Cubism is based on this idea. So it's the representation of modeling, relief, and cast shadow that epitomizes Western art practice. Leonardo also wrote extensively about shadow, how contrast was greater in bright sunlight than diffused light, how shadows modeled form in relief, and how shadows are affected by reflected light, and how they behave when light refracts around solid objects. These are all phenomena that continue to inform my work as well. Incidentally, I understand that the function of shadows on object recognition is still an ongoing topic in robotics and artificial intelligence today. Caravaggio took Leonardo's ideas in a different direction by using stronger, higher contrast lamplight, so there are fewer translucencies or transparencies in his shadows. Instead, darkness becomes an element in itself, carving forms out of the light. The dramatic tension of this approach is also something I find very powerful, and it informs subsequent artists' works, from Velázquez to Manet to Picasso. Moving to the still life, this is a painting by Zurbrand the Elder from about 1625, which shows the stark simplicity and religious reverence for the simple and everyday elevated to the sacred. This approach is one that influences my practice. Still life has been seen since classical antiquity as one of the lower or lesser genres, but it has also been noted that still life is actually subversive because it suggests a turnip, a quince, or a cardoon, for example, are as worthy of scrutiny as a king. The Spanish artists were influenced by the philosophy of writers such as Ignatius Loyola, who saw revelation in all creation. In still life, one's attention is being called to things that are not usually considered to be worthy of interest. Every era of still life painter must renegotiate this consideration. The artists of ancient Greece are criticized in the literature of the day for painting vegetable stalls instead of the gods. Caravaggio was criticized for painting peasants with dirty feet in unheroic poses. Arguably, it was an interest in the visible world, in the very look of things, which led to the Western scientific model of observation and experiment. This in turn led to some of the technological changes that we continue to experience today. The voyages of discovery that necessitated mapping and the study of astronomy, the so-called discovery by the West of new lands and species, images of which were recorded by the artists of the time. All are part of the zeitgeist, which necessitated that artists formulate and polish their descriptive abilities. Yeah, that's small. Enlightenment philosophers such as John Locke in England turned their attention to subjects like shadow perception and the depiction of shadows in art. Locke famously posed the question of whether a so-called innocent or unschooled observer would in fact recognize a line drawing of a sphere with cross-hatching on it as a depiction of a three-dimensional ball with shadows and highlights on it, or would one simply see a flat circle with markings on it? Both the microscope and telescope involved the creation and refinement of glass lenses, which are the precursors of the cameras and video recorders we use today in our continual, some would say obsessive, interest in the visual phenomena of experience. It's no coincidence that Anton van Leeuwenhoek, credited with the invention of the microscope, was a neighbor of Vermeer's in Delft, and in fact was also an executor of Vermeer's will. Now, jumping ahead about 4 centuries, I want to talk about another artist who used objects. Duchamp started a trend in modern art which is arguably the most pervasive, the ready-made. The ready-made can be defined as an object that is not depicted or represented, but simply presented. Duchamp was both questioning and poking fun at art and the institution of the museum when he placed objects such as a bicycle wheel or a shovel on a pedestal. In one sense, he was underscoring the idea that it is what the artist chooses as an object of contemplation which is important. Further, it's the act of placing an object in a museum which validates the object. He's also saying that art does not have to be an individual creation or even a unique handmade object. I think the downside to this approach is that if anything can be art, then in a certain sense nothing is art, and if anyone can be an artist, no one is. So obviously bad news for me. Contemporary artists such as Damien Hirst seem to continue to play with this idea. Here, rather than depicting a slaughtered animal, a favorite subject of Baroque painters such as Peter Ertzen, here the animal itself is presented, preserved in formaldehyde, framed in its own museum display case. Okay, so finally one of my paintings. This work illustrates my main interests, the depiction of natural light, the play of light on objects, particularly the observation of optical effects, such as translucency, transparency, reflection. I'm interested in how light is colored and changed by the objects it encounters, and how light colors and changes the appearance of shadows. Robert Hughes said that realism is the eye's ability to surprise the mind. This comment is one of my touchstones. Many people have suggested that painting itself has become less relevant today, especially the Duchampians, or those who trace their roots from his line of thinking. Certainly, photography and video have taken over many of the functions of painting, particularly the recording of people and events. But paradoxically, the conceptual basis of Western painting since the Renaissance, the idea that the two-dimensional surface of a painting is imagined as a three-dimensional box into which one is looking, is the illusionistic conceit that led to the camera obscura, the camera, moving pictures, and perhaps even the television. The imaginary space of painting, the space behind the surface, is what I think gives painting its power. In my work, I've constructed illusionistically a shallow stage parallel to the picture plane where my objects are set. I'm still interested in the challenge of making images which use the conventions of the photographic or real. I think this best expresses my feeling for the beauty of experience. My work engages in a dialogue with the visible world and also with the works of artists ranging from Vermeer to Velázquez, both of whom explore some of the same ideas and had a highly tuned and refined interest in optical phenomena, such as shadows and reflections. Again, I'd like to stress the Western bias towards information gathering and the understanding of solid objects and their placement in measurable space. I still value the contributions of the artists who have gone before. I want to keep learning from them, although I think it is important to update your work and not merely try to copy others or to have a period look to your paintings. Many artists studying at traditional academies today have a 19th century attitude toward their work. I think this is a big mistake because as much as one can love the past, it's important not to fall in love with a certain look, which precludes really looking intensely and developing your own vision. An artist who I think avoids some of these pitfalls is Claudio Bravo. Bravo is a Chilean artist but a resident of Morocco who follows the ideals of classicism. His work has been a huge influence on me for several reasons. It's been pointed out that artists who are not from the so-called center, say Santiago or Edmonton, are often attracted to classicism as a universal language with which to communicate. I like this idea and feel less isolated when seeing the work of other contemporaries like Bravo. Someone I've lost who said, "A work of art is valid if it adds something to its own tradition that previously did not exist." I think this is true of many contemporary realists who are using convention, but adding their own handwriting to those conventions. Jack Chambers was a Canadian artist who also inspired me. It was a retrospective of his at the Glenbow in the 80s that really shifted my work towards realism. To quote Chambers, "Perceptualism does not look back into the artist, but persists outwards beyond the object. In the art of perceiving the world, man is linked intuitively with it. The more real the painting is, the more mysterious it is." Chambers refers to the peculiar impact of some paintings where reality is so imminent that one feels one has stepped off the conveyor belt of time momentarily and glimpses the world in pause. Few paintings do this, but when it happens, the viewer on the outside looking in is able to experience the flow of time in which he is traveling and of which he is seldom, if ever, conscious. This is a painting that I did in 1993. My early still lifes had been overloaded with objects. I was trying to convey the idea of abundance or excess that those of us possess in this part of the world, and which is also a Baroque theme. Then my work became much simpler. I wanted more focus on a single object rather than the cacophony of many objects in a single painting. Also, I wanted to explore drapery as a subject and counterpoint to the objects. Up to this time, I had often included a window as a reference to the outside world. Now I eliminated all outside references, except for the natural light entering the picture. I use direct sunlight in contrast to someone like Claudio Bravo, who uses the classical indirect northern light in his paintings. I've always responded to strong sunlight and the contrast it gives. Da Vinci recommended a soft indirect light to bathe the objects, but perhaps because of my prairie upbringing, I prefer strong, dramatic sunlight. Perhaps there's even a touch of cubism in the way object contours are broken by strong light and shadow contrasts within my paintings. This was also a contribution of Caravaggio, who replaced the certainty and order of Renaissance space with a sometimes fractured and ambiguous use of light that bisects the subjects of his paintings. I believe that if you want people to look at your work intensely, you've got to look intensely yourself. and to come to an understanding of what and how you are viewing the world. This is another reason I have found a home in still life, because it allows the viewer to experience the same vision the artist had. This lends still life a deceptively neutral look, whereas I think that still life is in fact incredibly expressive. Picasso said that a casserole dish could express anguish if the artist projected this feeling onto the object. This is another reason why so many realists, realism being a supposedly styleless style, look completely different from one another. I use photography in my work as an aid to gather information. Especially given my subject matter in lighting, I don't think the work could be realized any other way. But I don't consider myself a photorealist either. To me, a photorealist is one who retains the camera's vision in their paintings. Things such as extreme out of focus areas or overexposed highlights are things I try to avoid in my paintings. I use multiple exposures of the same image with different areas of focus and lighting so that I can create a seamless whole in my paintings. I'm trying to adjust the various parts of the composition so each area is articulated. I would also never project a slide and trace it because this gives a lifeless, weightless feeling to the image. I draw by hand using a photograph and grid system. This enables me to make changes, clarify, and correct distortions in the image. The difference between a photograph and a realist painting is that the photograph offers no resistance to its making. This is why everyone can make a photograph with varying levels of skill. The painting, though, is all resistance. This is why it takes years to learn to adjust tone and color to depict the illusion of 3 dimensions onto a 2-dimensional surface. The paint itself is an object that also functions illusionistically, so that what is being viewed is the interaction of subject and the means of its making in paint. This is, I think, the subject and meaning of painting, the interaction of the artist with the world, mediated by the substance of paint. In photography, one largely accepts the medium as transparent. This is why news photos are powerful in the way that a photorealist painting of an airplane crash, for example, is not. Some people have sought to dismiss realism as just painting what you see. To me, this ignores the entire history of art making. In other words, how do we see? What system of mark making or coloring do we use? How do visual conventions such as overlap, diminution of scale, perspective, the illusion of light, etc. come together to produce an image? And what do these things tell us about the time in which the object is made? Every era must renegotiate its relationship with the real or outside world. This is why a Leonardo, Vermeer, or Degas look real, but appear so different from one another. To me, realism is not about a lot of details in terms of information. The Baroque artists I like also realized that, paradoxically, too much detail lessens the 3-dimensional effect one is trying to achieve. Just as a good novel must condense narrative in order to be exciting, so must a painting select and eliminate detail to be interesting. Perceptual scientists and French artists such as Chardin argued this in the 18th century, and it appears to hold true today. After I had explored drapery as a counterpoint in my work, I decided to become immersed in the dark background, so beloved by Spanish masters. I like the high contrast and metaphysical hush created by a simple background. Interestingly, this also relates the work to certain contemporary photographers, such as Adam Foose or Robert Mapplethorpe, in its starkness and simplicity. The work also underlines the theatrical nature of still life, where the artist is in essence a stage director, lighting and arranging his inanimate cast on the tabletop stage. I haven't yet spoken of my use of fruit and flowers as subject matter. Some might find a lemon or a flower boring or trite, but I still find the physical, visual fact of them interesting. As a building block of art, something three-dimensional with color and texture makes them a useful subject. This is why most students start out with the still life, to try and understand the fundamentals of light, shade, shape, and color. Again, this is also another reason for the typically low status assigned still life in the academy. In contrast, there have been many artists who have delved into the metaphysical and symbolic power of flowers as memorials or celebrations of life. Physically, still life taps into some of our earliest impulses to explore the world in terms of tangible objects with different shapes, textures, and colors. To quote Michael Kimmelman, maybe this is why artists who push us to look more carefully at simple things may also strike a slightly melancholic note. They remind us of a childlike condition of wonderment that we abandoned once we became adults. Flowers also evoke the cycle of life and death, fertility, and fleeting beauty. This is another theme from the Baroque era, which I still feel has relevance today. To put flowers in the context of the politics and economics of the world, they may also be considered as symbols of the order we have imposed on nature. We could consider also the global flower market, mercantile consumerism, and the abundance of the Western world. One could explore land usage, trade between rich and poor nations, the history of horticulture, and so on. This could give another meaning to the phrase, "stop and smell the flowers." The Zen tradition of mindfulness, which I understand as an intense focus and awareness of our surroundings, is what I've tried to unite with the Baroque tradition of revelation, quite literally with the object illuminated for the viewer. In Japanese translation, the term for still life is calm things. Not incidentally, Calm Things is also the title of my partner Shauna's as yet unpublished book of essays on living with still life, which I found quite inspirational. I've continued to try and simplify and concentrate my looking, and in my most recent paintings, I've used a light, luminescent background, so the objects are bathed in light. The artist James Turrell has said, "If you think of all the cathedrals and sacred places in the world, there aren't many that don't involve light as a spiritual element." We also have a physical relationship to light. We drink it in as vitamin D. Our physical and mental health is connected directly to light. My last several slides show images from a new series I'm working on called The History of Still Life. In it, I've taken iconic masterpieces from Pompeii to Warhol, and rather than copy the paintings, I've tried to replicate the still life arrangements of the various artists I've chosen and paint my own versions of them in the so-called neutral realist style, which I practice. This one you will remember as the Zurbaran from earlier this evening. This is my version of a famous Goya painting of salmon slices. These works have haunted my still life for the last 20 years, and I thought it would be interesting and deeply instructive to quote them directly. They also pay homage, acknowledging a debt, an important ritual for an artist, I believe. I wanted to see what would remain of an iconic masterpiece and what would be recognizable as my work. So the series is partly deconstruction, partly homage, and part challenge. Yeah, that's my version of Van Gogh. The work might be seen as tongue-in-cheek by some, blasphemous by others. They also may be a comment on my own geographical isolation from the masterpieces of Western art. As a realist, I wanted to know how much a work of art had power because of the style of the maker, and how much would be recognizable in, say, a Cézanne or Picasso for the composition and objects alone. That's a Monet jar of apricots, my version of it. That's a Salvador Dali did a very famous painting of a loaf of bread. It almost relates it to the earlier Baroque work, but it's a Dali I'm quoting there. That's Andy Warhol.